listening to The Culture Report, Voice of Russia, America's weekly look into the world of arts, culture, and history. I'm Rob Sachs. 40 years ago today was a dark day in Chilean history as the military overthrew their democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. As a result of the coup, many of Allende's supporters were forced into exile, including Patricio Manns, a well-known singer of ballads. Manns was a former journalist whose music reflected the dreams and upheaval of the time period. Joining me now to talk more about the music of Manns is our own Brittany Peterson, who recently spoke with him. Brittany, welcome.
Hi, Rob. Thanks.
So tell us more about what the music culture of Chile was like before the coup.
Well, Manns was a popular singer in the late 60s and early 70s. Salvador Allende was elected in 1970. And Manns and a lot of other singers at the time, what are you supposed to write about? Love and revolution. It's Latin America in the 60s. So people were writing about what was happening. There was a student movement at the time. Chile was on this political path to try to build a socialist society through democratic means. So that was this plan that they were trying to do through Allende, and Allende lost 2 elections before and was finally elected on his 3rd run, and Patricio Manns had worked with him on both times. So there was a lot of dreaming, there was a lot of political activism. Those were the hippie years in the States, and you could pretty much compare them with that time in Chile, and everyone had a cause, and it was not simply rebel to rebel. It was, how can we build a place where there is actually opportunities for all people? So that was kind of what was going on in Chile at the time, and the music certainly reflected that.
And you mentioned there was a connection between Manns and Allende, that Manns worked for Allende. What was the extent of that?
So Manns worked with Salvador Allende in his election campaign, the 3 different times that Allende went for the presidential seat in Chile. Other singers like the famous Victor Jara, who was a close friend of Patricio Manns, also worked on this election trail. But since Victor Jara died in the dictatorship, I had the privilege to talk with Patricio Manns, who is in his late 70s now, and he worked closely with Salvador Allende. His job at the time was to film him on the campaign trail, and somebody gave him a camera and said, "Don't move from Allende's side. Stay here, ask him questions about the news that goes on during the day, what his opinion is, and we'll make movies about that. We'll use that to add to the publicity for his campaign." So that was his job. But in addition to just working with him in a professional setting, he got to travel all over Chile with Salvador Allende. So there was ample time to talk. Manns told me stories about them sitting around a campfire late at night, drinking wine, and he said that Salvador Allende didn't really like tables, so they would sit on the ground, and that was his preference. And this man was president of Chile for 3 years, and Allende got to hear direct teachings, political teachings from this man, sitting around the campfire with a bunch of men who were aged 30 and under, and Allende was teaching them, this is what the right means, this is what it means to be left, and this is what we want to do for Chile. And so essentially you could say that Salvador Allende was Manns' civics teacher.
And so when you were hanging out with Manns in Chile, he gave you some of his music. Can you tell us about some of the songs we're going to hear from Manns?
So the first song we're going to hear is No Cierres los Ojos, which means don't close your eyes. And Manns wrote this song as soon as Allende was elected in 1970. A lot of people were ecstatic. They were celebrating that Allende became president, but Manns knew better. He wrote this song called No Cierres los Ojos, don't close your eyes. Don't get too comfortable with the win.
Let's take a listen.
Vienen de las cordilleras, de la pampa, de la estepa, de los bosques, de las islas, de los llanos o del mar. Son de cobre, son de hierro, son de lana, son de roble, son de arena, son de nieve, son de piedra, son de sal. Son hombres de mi país, repartidos al azar, que empuñando su esperanza y blandiendo sus jirones y escribiendo su confianza fueron a las elecciones a ganar.
So that's No Cierres los Ojos, written by Patricio Manns. We're talking with our own Brittany Peterson about the Chilean musician who was writing about, I guess, the election of Salvador Allende, who was bringing about a new socialist era to Chile. And this is, I guess, a time of jubilation for the two as he finally assumed the presidency after 2 times, and the 3rd time he won it, right?
Exactly, but Patricio decided to write this song because so many people were ecstatic about the win, but he was essentially saying, do not relax too much. There is still a lot of work to be done. This is not going to be an easy road. Don't close your eyes.
And then just 3 years later, he was writing some very different kind of music because the coup happened and Allende was thrown out of power.
That's right. The economy was very unstable at the time for various reasons, and Allende was thrown out of power by the military coup, and he actually killed himself that same day, Allende, inside the presidential palace. So that was a hard time for a lot of people. There was a lot of political persecution. If someone was considered subversive, a lot of people were students or professors or artists. They had to go into hiding, or they risked being picked up by the secret police and facing torture or worse.
So that's what Patricio Manns did. He went into hiding, went into exile, left the country, right?
Yeah, he left the country. Well, first he had to go... first he went to a bunch of embassies to request exile, and they all rejected him because he was too subversive. They thought his lyrics were very subversive, and they didn't want to grant him exile. So finally the Cuban embassy accepted him. He hid out there for 3 months, and then he got to Cuba. But then when he was in exile, one of his interesting roles that he had from there was working as the spokesperson for an armed group that was doing resistance in Chile, that was resisting the Pinochet dictatorship. It was a militarized group, and it was an armed group. So Patricio Manns from France, from his home in Paris, was the spokesperson. He had the stage presence, he had great communication skills, and he also wrote the anthem, I guess you could say, for that organization. And this organization is actually the one that is responsible for the attempted murder of Pinochet in the mid-'80s. It was a failed attempt, but it was this group that did attempt that. So all these people living in exile saying, well, what can we do from abroad? And so they organized, and they tried to take Pinochet out of power. So Patricio Manns was involved in that, and that was the height of his artistic creation. He was also a playwright and wrote a lot of different things, but among those, he wrote this one song called Cuando me acuerdo de mi país, or When I Remember My Country.
Let's take a listen.
Cuando me acuerdo de mi país, me sangra un volcán. Cuando me acuerdo de mi país, me escarcho y estoy. Cuando me acuerdo de mi país, me muero de paz. Me nublo y me voy, me aclaro y me doy, me siembro y se van, me duele y no soy, cuando me acuerdo de mi país.
So I don't speak Spanish that well, but I can clearly understand it's a sad song, thinking about his homeland. What are some of the lyrics he's saying there?
Well, he's saying, when I think about my country, I think he said, I bleed an entire volcano. He just says it hurts so bad. He's just thinking, he's very nostalgic for his country. But, Patricio was involved in trying to bring about the dream, which was a socialist society through democratic means. He was involved in that. And so but now that he was living in exile, not only is he nostalgic for wanting to be in his own country, in his own land, but it physically hurts him because the dream he was working so hard for was interrupted.
Well, we already know how the story kind of ends in that you interviewed him in Chile, so we know that Manns made it back to his homeland. And from what I hear, when he returned, there was a pretty big concert to talk about the country being free and to talk about the new way forward for Chile.
Yeah, there was this really beautiful moment in 1990 when Patricio went back for a visit. He didn't move back to Chile yet at this time, but democracy was now in place. And there was this concert in a stadium that was used as a torture and detention center. And it was in this stadium that Manns' good friend and emblematic folk singer Victor Jara was tortured and killed on, I think, day 3 or 4 of the military dictatorship. So when Manns was there in the same stadium where his intimate friend was tortured and killed, he described that moment to me, and he said, you know, I don't know if there's life after death. I'm not one to say something is certain when I don't know it isn't. But he said, when I was there, it felt like Victor was there. He said it felt like there must have been some element of his, something of his that was left in that stadium, because that was kept walking around because I felt Victor was there. So I was in front of all these people on the stage, and I said, "Hey, Victor, this one's for you." And the crowd went wild. And so that's Patricio's description of what happened the first year of democracy in Chile. He went back for this concert at this emblematic place where his friend was killed. And so that was kind of one of his first performances once he came back to Chile.
And this is music of the 60s that he's most associated with, and Victor was associated with, obviously, because that's when he was doing it before he was killed. Is this music still being played in Chile now?
It is. This music, it's hard to go anywhere without hearing it in Chile. Both songs by Patricio Manns, by Victor Jara, there have been entire bands that have formed that are inspired on playing their style of music. And young people today, especially with this big student movement that's been going on in the last 2.5 years in Chile, all the young people sing their songs and chant their lyrics at marches. Right before I left Chile, I was at a bar on a Wednesday night, and there was this young singer-songwriter who, although he writes his own songs, loves to sing songs by Victor Jara. And so I went and I met him, and we listened to the song that he sang, and we'll listen to it now. This one is called El Aparecido, or The Ghost, and this is a song written by Victor Jara in tribute to Che Guevara.
That was Matias Melo performing Victor Jara's song in Chile, and we're back in the studio now with Brittany Peterson talking about the revolutionary music of the 60s in Chile. And as you were saying before we heard the song, these songs, I guess, have now a new meaning. They were talking about the revolutions and the revolutionary ideas of the 60s, but now, today in 2013, young people have appropriated these songs and have made it relevant to what they're thinking, what they're doing.
They certainly have, and the education movement, again, about 2.5 years ago, kind of sparked these series of movements, but Chile has absolutely ignited, and it's even hotter right now that the presidential election is taking place this November. But there have been movements, it's mainly to ask for free public education for all Chileans, have that access accessible for everyone, because so many people are suffering from so much debt. And then another aspect of these revolutions, you could say, or these movements going on, is to decentralize Chile. Half of the population lives in Santiago, where I just moved from. You can imagine what the metro is like there. And